Good afternoon. My name is David Laban. I'm the President and CEO of the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement community partners. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Every prosecutor's office in the United States has been deeply impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, causing remote operations and work from home to become the new normal. As states begin to relax their restrictions on the movement and activities of their communities, courts and prosecutor offices are also beginning to expand their operations. This webinar will highlight some of the offices and their attempts to address these challenges, as well as to share successful strategies. Given the nature of this pandemic, the challenges and solutions that will arise will occur in different stages and at different times. Given these unprecedented circumstances, this is the first webinar in what will be a three-part webinar series that APA is developing, which will address these phases as they arise in the upcoming months. During today's webinar, you will be able to submit questions for our speakers using the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar located on the right side of your screen. While you may ask questions during the course of the presentation, we will hear from our speakers first and ask questions after. If you need additional assistance, please feel free to connect directly at webinars@apainc.org. Today's webinar will be moderated by our chair, Jean Peters Baker, the Jackson County Prosecutor. Prosecutor Baker was appointed prosecutor in May of 2011 and elected the position in November of 2012. She is only the second woman elected to lead the Jackson County Prosecutor's Office. The first, now the former U.S. Senator Claire McCaskill, hired Prosecutor Baker as a young assistant. Prosecutor Baker has served in nearly every unit of her office. She has cemented her reputation during her tenure as Jackson County's elected prosecutor as a fearless and compassionate advocate for the victims of crime, especially the young and most vulnerable, and a champion working with police and community leaders to confront the complexities and address the violence in her community. Jean?
Thank you, Dave. And welcome to everybody else. I'm really grateful you're willing to spend a late Friday afternoon with all of us. So thank you very much for doing so. This organization, the APA, serves this role for me as a prosecutor leading an office. It serves as a place I can go for resources. It serves as a place that I can gain other practices, and I can hone my own skills because, as all of you know, leading offices, you have to be an HR manager. You have to be good at budget. It's good if you know something about criminal prosecution as well, and you know how to file a case, and you know what's fileable, and even how to go carry that through a courtroom. But our jobs are so complex that it takes a whole lot of skill sets to be able to pull this off. So today we wanted to give this opportunity to prosecutors who are joining us, and an opportunity to ask some additional experts for some guidance and some help. And so we have sort of an assortment of people on here. There are things we are worried about. We're worried about bringing our folks back into a setting where we don't want them to get sick. That I know that's probably at the forefront of everybody's mind right now. I'm in my office, but I have people coming back in very small amounts so far. Just a few people are coming into the office on each floor, and I feel like that's best for now because this is we're still in this. Everybody's jurisdiction is a little bit different, but we're certainly in this together. So I want to keep my folks safe that agree to work for this office that I lead, and I want to do everything I can to know how to keep them safe. Beyond that, it's not just our responsibility to keep the people who work for us safe. It is all those people that come into our orbit. That includes victims, witnesses. It includes court personnel, probation and parole, police officers, and criminal defendants that we charge with crimes. They are our responsibility as well to make sure that we are doing all that we know to keep them safe. So that's why we worked hard to kind of put together an agenda that we thought was a piece of this is on everyone's mind. And we hoped, well, I certainly hope that you get something from this today, that you get something to help you go back home and lead your offices through this pandemic. So with that, I think I'm going to introduce our first speaker on the agenda, and that is many of our friends, John Chisholm. He is the DA in Milwaukee County. You know, John has been around for a while, and those of you who had the opportunity to be in John's space, you know that he is a place that you go for a resource, a guy that's probably seen it before. And so you can walk through the issue that you have with him. And I've done that personally. He has been the district attorney in Milwaukee County since 2007. He is a career prosecutor. I like that about John very much, that he started in the office and worked his way through before he became the elected. This is a tough guy, but a smart guy, and a guy that I think does a lot to lead the rest of us throughout running our offices. So I'm going to pass it on to DA Chisholm, and you have the floor, John.
Well, thank you so much, Jean, and I hope everybody is staying safe and staying healthy during this time. I really want to just take this time to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Swain. He goes by Jeff Swain. He has been absolutely invaluable as a resource and as an expert in helping us design our response to the coronavirus pandemic. You know, David mentioned it before we started, and that is that as prosecutors, we're pretty good at recognizing when we're out of our depth, and that's when we run to experts, and usually we have to pay them a lot of money. In this particular case, we had a prior standing relationship with Jeff, in that he had worked extensively with my chief deputy, Kent Lovern, when they were examining ways to make our schools healthier, make them safer, and taking a public health approach to it. So Jeff was the medical director for the city of Milwaukee's health department. He was a city health professional for over 26 years, and so we developed that relationship. When the pandemic broke out, we relied upon our existing collaborations and relationships within the system and outside of the system through our Community Justice Council. And it was actually our regional manager of the Public Defender's Office that early on, as we gathered together for our emergency meetings on how to address the pandemic, Tom Reed, the public defender, urged that we bring a public health professional in, and the recommendation was for Jeff. And I will just say that it has been a game changer for us in Milwaukee. Really, from early on in the crisis, we had the benefit of a trained public health professional that was really just within our space. He was working directly with courthouse professionals and giving us advice on how to safely manage not only our own people, the general public, but equally importantly, how to manage our jail spaces and our correctional spaces, with an eye always towards making smart decisions that were directed at keeping the community safe as a whole. So just been tremendously grateful for Jeff's input. I just recommended that we give a couple minutes to Jeff. Jeff is also going to take a look at the outlines that are being prepared by the APA. He'll make comments and suggestions on those things. But most importantly, what he offered to me was that he feels strongly that an organization like APA and your individual offices would benefit immensely if you don't have that sort of dedicated relationship with a public health officer to help think through ways that you could create that kind of a relationship. And so I just thought I would I would give Jeff a couple moments just to talk about his experience working with us and his offer to work with you in the future and work with the APA in general. Final point I would make is that the other expert, so Jeff has been able to provide us invaluable insights on the public health front. I would also recommend, as you're all faced with reopening your workspace and addressing workflow issues, that that you also consult with other experts. We're going to be bringing in someone from the Army Corps of Engineers this coming Monday, and he's going to work with Jeff as well to actually look through things like workspace and workflow as we slowly try to reopen our space in as safe a way as possible. So with that, again, thank you, Jeff, for taking some time just to talk to my colleagues and provide your insights and experience. Just deeply appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, and thanks to everyone for this opportunity. It really is an honor to be here and to help support the important work that you're doing. And I guess I would just make a couple of broad comments, and then if there are more specific questions when we get down to the question and answer portion of this session, we could address those. But the first thing I would say is that in each of your local jurisdictions, there's a local governmental public health agency, a health department. They've got a health officer and they've got other trained public health professionals. And these people are very busy right now, but also they realize that part of their role is to help essential functions as well as now non-essential functions that are opening as well. But you all are an essential government function, and they know that their role is to help support essential government functions in getting back up to speed as safely as possible. And so I would really encourage you to reach out to those local public health agencies. I don't know all of the jurisdictions that you all represent, but I've seen some of them, and I know some of your public health colleagues in Multnomah County, in Seattle King County, in New York City and other places. And these are really highly trained professional public health people, as John said, and they're here to help you and they're interested. And the second thing is, I think it'd be very important to start thinking now about the longer term and developing those relationships, because although this coronavirus is going to be with us for a long time and it's really going to disrupt our lives and create a new normal, which is not anything like the old normal for many, many months, there are many, many other issues in which public health and public safety have a lot of overlap, a lot of synergy, a lot of common interests. Public health professionals over the last 10 to 20 years have really been focusing more and more on what we call social determinants of health. And those things have to do with some of the things that you are either directly working on around public safety or indirectly dealing with around concentrated neighborhood disadvantage, poverty, low educational attainment, and these sorts of things. And it's really hard for people to be safe or to be healthy if we don't try to figure out ways to work on those issues together. And I think you will find in the long run that your public health colleagues would be delighted to develop this kind of partnership. And so I encourage you each in your own jurisdictions to reach out. And then I do think, as John said, that there may be a great opportunity for APA as an organization to get one or maybe a couple of public health professionals that can serve as consultants and partners to you in supporting your work. So I think those are some of the big picture things I wanted to say. More specifically with regard to the pandemic response, I think a couple of overarching principles that I've tried to reinforce with my colleagues here in Milwaukee are that we do have to get our work back going, and yet the virus is going to be with us for quite some time. And so we have to understand that we don't have a way to be perfectly safe. There's really no way to make risk zero. What we have to do is make risk acceptably low, and then as low as further possible through whatever reasonable means we have. And so it's very basic stuff around, number one, trying to do whatever work remotely that can be done remotely and continuing that. And number two, when work must be done in person, to take necessary precautions, maintaining at least 6-foot distancing, maintaining face coverings whenever that 6-foot distancing is even possibly in doubt, frequent hand washing or hand sanitizing and cleaning of frequently touched surfaces, screening, questions about whether to screen people before they come into a courtroom or some other setting where they're kind of mandated to come, screening them for fever or for symptoms or for recent contact. And these are kind of things that I'm happy to get started helping a little bit with APA, and then maybe working with you to identify someone that can stick with you in the longer term, since I did recently retire, and I'm hoping to get retired again soon, but I'm happy to help in the short term. So I guess I think that's about the amount of time that we had set aside for some general remarks, and I look forward to hearing any further questions that you have when we get to that point in this presentation. But overall, it's just really an honor and a privilege to work with you, and I know my public health colleagues would jump at the opportunity to work with you in your own jurisdiction. So really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And, I would ask you to stick around. I think there will be some questions for you. So I think there is a chat box here that you can put a question in, and we would really like to hear from you guys on what your questions are. Okay, so we're gonna move along on down our agenda to Rod Underhill. Rod is the DA of Multnomah County in Portland. He is also the vice chair of the APA, and Rod is, I know, an avid bicycle rider. He makes us all look bad because this guy actually gets on a bike and rides to work. It's impressive. I dream of doing that, but I don't actually achieve it. So Rod's impressive for a variety of reasons. That's just one reason. So Rod too is one of those, like DA Chisholm, who started off in his office, working his way up into the office, became chief deputy, and took the office of district attorney in 2013. So Rod just announced his retirement, and I think there was an election for his position, but we feel very honored and privileged. I personally feel honored and privileged to have a few more months to serve with Rod Underhill, who is not just a good DA, but he's a good man. So Rod, was that enough for you to send me a good bottle of whiskey to Kansas City, or I can keep going?
No, you don't have to keep going. You're going to get a bottle of whiskey no matter what you said. So thank you very much. Hey, truly thank you, Gene. My pleasure to be participating with APA over these years, and this opportunity. Once again, APA has done an outstanding job of getting colleagues like us and our friends from across the country together to talk about important things, such as how to expand our operations during a pandemic. So, hey, let's get started. And yeah, we'll leave it right there at that screen for right now. The comments I'm about to make are a product of your board members over the course of 2 or 3 meetings, and even subgroups getting together and kind of brainstorming about messaging and ideas, tips, if you will, that we can pass on to our colleagues around the country. No doubt some of my remarks are going to be things that you've been thinking of already. You're already doing some of them. Hopefully this is an attempt to maybe add an idea that hasn't crossed your mind or you haven't quite gotten to yet, or in what order you should be considering things. So they're just meant for it to be helpful tips to each and every one of us as we move forward in expanding our operations. So the title of the presentation deals with immediate steps to expand our prosecutor office's staff operations. And so one of the places to consider beginning is developing an in-house expansion of services team. And I'm going to refer to that group now from here forward as who makes up the team and what does the team going to do. Now, this team concept early on should be a relatively small and manageable group of both your attorney and support staff. You're going to want this team to have strengths in particular areas that I plan to cover here as we go. Now, generally speaking, this team is likely going to be made up of your current existing managers and senior staff, whether they be attorneys or from that support staff advocacy program. What you're going to find yourself doing is assigning tasks and the responsibilities to these individual team members, sometimes pairing them up. Now, of course, this individual team member or pair of team members, they're going to be primarily responsible for a topic that you're going to assign them and such, but of course, they're going to draw on each other team members' strengths, ideas, and such, together with the broader members of your office. And so, what things should you be thinking about as far as regarding that expansion of operations to assign to team members? So in a bit of an order, a bit of a thought process, at least in my mind and your board members' mind, as we brainstorm this, you're going to want to put some of this down in writing. And in fact, you're going to want to put a lot of it down in writing. So you're going to have some policy drafting and implementation. So it begins with that kind of generalized premise. Now, what are you going to actually start to put down in policy and practice? And that's where you want a primary responsibility, and it's already been mentioned, but it is the safe work environment for your employees. That's step number one. You want to make sure that you're thinking of things such as staff morale and personal security. So you're going to want to put, as I mentioned, a team member, a manager likely in charge of this responsibility, but they're going to draw on everybody else's assistance and help. They're going to message to reassure to staff that the workplace is clean, workplace cleanliness and safety practices. Need to make sure that we're organizing this staff member, this leader, with the ability and partnership with communication to the staff, because we're going to want to communicate such things as daily cleanliness scheduling practices just as an ordinary course, but also we're going to talk about access to professional cleaning. So when those environments or situations occur that I'm going to touch on a little bit later, possibly develop. So you're going to want to have access to what we consider a deeper clean, a professional cleaning service that you can call in on a short-term basis, but meet the immediate needs. You're going to want to make sure that your staff knows that you have, that the office is prepared to assist with supplying sufficient and appropriate PP&E. Whether staff are encouraged to bring in their own, or if they forget, we want to make sure that you have enough. We want to make sure that we're reviewing distancing and design of the work environment sufficiently. So distancing, you've heard from our health professional at 6-foot distancing, and we need to make sure that people are reminded of that, sometimes constantly, but we also want to make sure that we are organizing our workspace such a way that it makes it easier to do that, to include such things as plexiglass. We need to make sure that this person, this staff person, team member, knows and has created a really ease of use access to your HR support, whether that's in-house HR support or the broader county or community HR support that supports your office. We also want to make sure that we are thinking about access to trauma and support for and relative to surrounding anxiety related issues that are going to affect our staff. And so it may be that they are not completely comfortable with talking to us about that. We want to make sure that they've got some professionals. And so what's an easy way for them to get a hold of that person and just make that available to them. Now, I already mentioned communication to staff. Another suggested team leader or asset here is going to be how do we communicate with staff? Have that be a primary responsibility from one of your team members. Not necessarily that they are the writer, but they sure can be. But you want to make sure that somebody has that responsibility. Some of the offices already have a communications director, so that's a little bit built in and going to make it easy. But if you don't, you want to draw from your already existing available resources. It's going to be best, we feel, to have as frequent as practicable and thorough communications with staff. Communicate well with them about simple stuff such as what's going on. They're looking for direction, they're looking for reassurance. Special considerations and assurances to your staff will be that you're thinking about them. You're thinking about their safety, that their needs are being cared for, and not just them, but their families and loved ones as well. You want to develop short-term and long-term plans surrounding these practices, meaning communication practices. For a while, we were operating on practically a daily, and sometimes, I don't want to exaggerate, but it felt like hourly communications with staff, but certainly was daily there for a while. It is eased into, at least for now, right now, we're on about a couple times a week, different than periodic urgent messaging that you want to make sure you're doing, or outside agencies that are reaching in. But I have a dedicated schedule of about twice a week, making sure that we're just touching base, reassuring, updating folks with internal and external information. Now, we may resort back to daily communications, just depending on the ebb and flow of the pandemic. Another area that you're going to want to consider having a team member assigned to in your office is research and planning. You're going to want to use data to assist in awareness of the resource pressure and tension points. Your office has experienced likely a significant amount of upheaval. It kind of feels like downtime, putting things on the back burner, side burners, lots of different things. By putting together a data team to understanding some of those pressure points, you're going to be way ahead and understanding where to redeploy your resources. We have developed a what I'll call a modest but very important dashboard for ourselves. We're keeping track of custody referrals, citation referrals, what we call direct presents. So those are where an arrest or a citation did not occur, but nonetheless a case submitted. We're doing this in a dashboard form, broken down within units in our office. So I know the hydraulics of, say, our domestic violence unit, the cases that are coming in, the hydraulics of custody cases, and we're comparing them to this time last year to see where we're developing kind of resource pressure points. Again, not to be too redundant, but the value of this is going to be, as you expand your operations, you'll have a better awareness of the areas to expand to. Do you need more deputies or resources in your family violence unit, as contrasted with maybe a misdemeanor unit with certain other crimes where you've seen a dip in the submissions during this pandemic? So it's going to assist you in prioritizing. I don't want to get too far ahead, but you're going to be reaching out, of course, working with your court system and other system partners, and this is going to help you to give them guidance about where you see the pressure points. I see that we've already moved to the next slide, so I'll keep going about this. Another team member. We've already heard from the health professionals, and just to reiterate much, if not all of what was already said by the previous presenters, you're going to want a team member who helps establish, if you don't already have one, that strong connection to local health professionals in your area. You're also going to want to make sure that you're familiarizing yourself with rules involving OSHA-related rules, the intersection of ADA, HIPAA, FMLA, Fair Credit and Reporting Acts. You're going to have many states outside of these federal-related laws and things that we are fundamentally aware of, but we're going to be needing to have a point person that really drills down in some of the minutia of these rules to make sure that we're complying, that we're understanding them. But also many of your individual states are going to have confidentiality requirements, such as anti-discrimination statutes, or like in Oregon, we have data privacy statutes. So you're going to want to have a point person that is responsible for that task and organizing that communication with local experts, local health professionals. We're going to seek guidance from them in the planning and design. We're going to incorporate the public health official as much as you can to make sure that you're doing everything as safe and appropriate as possible. You want to start planning for every contingency now. You should be, if you're not already, you'll be having some complicated conversations, I'm sure, surrounding, hey, what are we going to do? Are we going to test folks before they come back into the workplace? And if the answer is yes, what does that look like? And if the answer is no, why aren't you? And what does that look like? You're going to want to be planning for a surge in the outbreaks. Now, we're all optimistic that we're going to see this, we flattened the curve, so to speak, across the country, and that we're on a trend toward not revisiting where we were back in March and April. But that may not be the case. And so new outbreaks, what do we do if there is a reoccurrence, and how do we respond, and make sure that you're planning for that possibility? If you haven't already, your offices, if you haven't already experienced a staff person who tested positive, for COVID-19, like my office did early on, you want to prepare for that. And so, you know, some of the things you're going to want to familiarize yourself with is, what do you do if a staff person tests positive for COVID? What do you do if a person develops symptoms that make you suspect strongly, or they suspect personally that maybe they are maybe they have been impacted by positive testing in their future with COVID-19? And so what's going to occur when those types of issues present themselves? Are the health needs, and so just some things to be thinking about. And first and foremost, are the health needs of the person, that staff employee of yours, are they being met? Do they have sufficient leave hours in their, I guess I'll call it the sick bank, right, in order to make sure that they're going to be taken care of and cared for? And are there other federal related rules or county related rules that can help supplement that sick bank, so to speak, of hours? You're going to want to look at work assignments and tasks that are unfinished. You're going to want to have conversations surrounding contact tracing. First, what is it? And who does it? And you're going to want to learn about once you've determined who in your local jurisdiction does a contact tracing, what do you do with the results? And if those results are positive, who is told? What is the messaging? Who can't be told? That's where familiarity with all those rules that I was mentioning is going to help you. Communications about what can you say, what do you say, both the staff, and sometimes you're going to have outside agency inquiry, such as a court. Maybe it was an attorney that was appearing in court, and that's part of the contact tracing conversation. You're going to want to examine enhanced cleaning practices surrounding that positive tested employee, and considerations certainly around the vulnerabilities, these especially vulnerable staff members within your office, and or those who are caring for, that live in the home or household of that staff person. They're going to be going home to caring for, say, an elderly parent or some such thing, and how do you create a avenue for those staff individuals to alert you to those vulnerable, either a vulnerable employee or vulnerable family or household member. The functionality of staff, it's already been touched on, but I'll attempt to speed through it pretty quickly. You want to be intentional about rotations of staff, and be respectful and aware of these ideals surrounding, we currently today, if we were to have checked, we probably have about 25% of my workforce that physically was in the office. And once they've completed tasks that we need physical presence to in order to complete, we're releasing folks and sending them home to telework for the balance of the day. But we also work in intentional shifts, and we spreading out those shifts such that there is as much time and space, if you will, in between shifts, such that if someone is impacted by a positive COVID-19 event, that we have created space by them and our workforce. Hey, another thing to be thinking about as you expand your operations is, how do people get to work? A lot of our folks, our main courthouse is downtown Portland. And so a tremendous number of our employees, my employees, they come in through public transit. And so they have concerns about just riding the bus, right? Or what we call our MAX train. The proximity and such are chilling and sometimes can be overwhelming. So what we did is we worked with local public parking. We managed, it was Jeff Howes, my first assistant, who really carried the water on this, managed to get a tremendous number, just a sizable number of very low cost parking passes. And so we were able to, the office paid for those. We got stacks of them sitting at our entryways for our staff employees to take one home for the night for when they come back tomorrow, right, so to speak, and that they can drive their own vehicle and park in very close proximity to the courthouse and get to work. Hey, I want to talk about grand juries and jury trials, and so I'll take a few minutes. So Multnomah County has, at any given time before the pandemic, we had 3 full-time operating citizen grand juries made up of 7, as I mentioned, citizens. We have continued 1 full-time grand jury throughout this pandemic. Now, not without some controversy and not without a fair amount of work, of course. We had significant participation and help from our court system. Of course, they're the ones who select our 7 citizen grand juror members. We moved from a very relatively small environment historically for the grand jury presentations. We moved it to a large courtroom. We created physical distancing that made everybody comfortable and safe as practically could be, and actually is, I believe. And then we also worked with our IT staff, and we pivoted very quickly, like many of you no doubt are, to encouraging and almost, we're not quite insisting on remote testimony, but we're working toward a very, very aggressive remote testimony, certainly by our local law enforcement. 2 of our 3 big agencies are very aggressively using remote testimony. We're using currently GoToMeeting, although we're trending toward WebEx likely here in the near future. But these officers are testifying from places other than the courthouse, other than the grand jury room, and their testimony is being remoted in before that 7-citizen grand jury. We're also making that resource available to citizen witnesses and victims. Those individuals that do come down to the courthouse are also offered then another opportunity, as we have a remote capability. The grand jury, if you think of it as a courtroom, well, just down the hall, we've got another facility set up, another room set up with cameras and such, using technology like we are here today to remote testimony, even though it's from down the hall, but it adds to that physical distancing and the comfort of everyone else. Now, no doubt there's a fair amount of logistics and technical considerations to make this go virtual. I asked one of my deputies to summarize and provide for each of us a document summarizing those practices, so you should have that available to you. Certainly, if any questions present themselves, feel free to reach back around and give me a call. Now, jury trials. We have had 2 jury trials during the pandemic. The presumption is that, you know, we don't want to necessarily have jury trials. There are a number of variables as it relates to that. That being said, we have had 2, and they have been as a result of concerns surrounding the collision, if you will, of statutory provisions regarding custody status and constitutional considerations. And I'll overly simplify it by saying, if we didn't have a jury trial, then we were going to be releasing the individuals at issue. One of them was charged with very, very serious rape allegations. We were unwilling to agree to his release under any circumstance. Again, I won't give you all the details, but it was a very thoughtful process on our part. And ultimately, the court was very agreeable to that fact. They saw these pressure points and went to great pains to make sure that we were able to impanel a 12-person jury here in Multnomah County. It was the use of a couple of different courtrooms, making sure that the jury veneer had physical distancing between all of them and such. And again, I asked that deputy, his name is Sean Huey, who tried that rape case over the course of a handful of days, to supply kind of a summary, if you will, of lessons learned, experiences that he and the court and defense attorney engaged in, and jurors. So that document, I believe, is attached and available for your use and you know, and kind of, I guess, edification, if you will, as we go on. He did have an observation that was made, and I'll overly simplify it in the interest of time because I'm looking at the clock and I think I'm due to wrap up. But he summarized it by saying, yeah, there was a lot of logistical challenges, certainly, but once the jury was sworn and impaneled, things really generally went quite smoothly, all things considered. And the jury was able to appropriately return a guilty verdict for rape in the first degree and many other associated charges. So I will continue to make myself available. I'll wrap up for right now and make myself available, of course, for questions, if any, as we progress. But thanks again, APA.
Thank you, Rod. I appreciate all of that. And we're going to keep walking through. I think, is Dana able to join us at this time?
I am here. Can you hear me and see me?
I can hear you and see you. Welcome.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, thank you for having me. So I don't want to be repetitive of what your public health expert and Rod has already gone through, but my job here is to give you sort of the 10,000-foot view from the employment law perspective. I'm an employment attorney and a legal ethics attorney at Holland and Knight. All of the information that I'm sharing with you is available on our website at hklaw.com. And once you get there, you will see a COVID-19 resource. And feel free, anytime you're looking for information that you think will be helpful for you, to click on that link and access any of the insights that we have there. I think our team has written about 395 insights since COVID started on everything from employment to land use, et cetera, et cetera.
Dean, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is Jean again. I just wanted to see, Dana, if you were okay with me sharing the link to that document that you created. It's
of course.
Fabulous, and if I could share it now, would be appreciated.
Of course.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh no, that's okay. That's all right. And that the link that she's about to share is also available on the website along with the other materials I was talking about. So we all entered this COVID-19 reality with both feet into the pool and quickly became submerged. And it took a while for us to develop any kind of context for lessons learned. How do we apply in the workforce the lessons that we're learning as we move along? And the three areas that we're looking into the most as employment lawyers are these. What is the workplace going to look like when you bring your people back? What is your workforce going to look like when you bring your people back? And what are the key employment risks that you need to be aware of as you work your way through those two critical functions? So what I'm talking about, first of all, how are you going to bring your people back? Obviously, your state and local orders, the terms of those as they apply to your ability to bring your people back are key. The public health experts' advice, CDC, key. But on a more practical level, once you have all that digested, is what does your workforce look like now? Because as we work our way through good times and bad with COVID, we are likely to see expansions and contractions again of these orders. And so considering now what you want your workforce to look like, for example, are you going to bring your people back all at one time? The answer to that is probably no, because you won't be able to socially distance them in the way that you're required to do in most jurisdictions. And so do we want to divide our workforce into teams, half in, half out? Do we want to divide it into teams where the only people that are in are people who are engaging in trials or grand juries? Do we want to stagger our day to the extent we can, particularly with our support staff? How many of them can continue to telework? Do we need to have them all in the workforce? And so really sitting down with the group that Rod described, your pandemic response team, as I call it, sit those people down and figure out what you need your workforce to look like. If you bring everybody back at once, what we've already begun to see is not only an uptick likely in COVID-19 diagnoses, but also an expansion of your risk as you bring them back. Next, many of you have multiple locations. I know that Rod does. Are you going to look different from location to location? So consider that. You know, as you move into this process, those of you that have unionized workforces in whole or in part need to make sure that whatever decisions you're making comply with your union contracts. When we talk about telework and continued telework, it brings us to what we as employment lawyers view as your key risk from a wage and hour perspective. And that is federal law and many state laws require you to track the hours that your employees work very, very closely for overtime purposes and for other purposes as well. There are, as we see this telework sort of taking shape, what we're learning is many people who are working off-site, who are non-exempt, for example, aren't tracking their time sufficiently, which leaves the employer exposed to later wage and hour claims. So be very, very careful of that. Have a system in place where people can check in, whether that's an electronic system where they check in and out for mandated breaks and meal periods as well. But also just so you know what your workforce is looking and who's doing what work. Second, what's the environment going to look like that you're bringing people back into? We've already talked a lot today. I've heard about social distancing, about PPE and how you're going to provide that. What we haven't really talked about is health and safety daily checks of your staff. Are you going to do that by taking their temperature when they come to the office? If you're going to do that, or how are you going to maintain the confidentiality of this information? Because that's probably not something that can be done in the presence of all of the other workers. More often what we're seeing as time goes on and more of our clients are heading back into the workforce is daily questionnaires that are part of the check-in process, mostly electronically, but sometimes handwritten depending on your resources. That's what we're seeing that work best with is a check-in. So if you have people who check into time and billing electronically, having the first thing be an "Are you well?" questionnaire with questions indicating, how they're doing and assuring that they're okay, that provides you with cover later on. Keeping in mind, for those of you who are dealing with non-exempt employees, elevators, and Rod can tell you I've mentioned this probably 10 times in the course of the past week because we're seeing this as a really big issue. We had a study by a real estate company in California that advised us that for those of you that are in high-rise buildings, anything over 10 to 15 stories, it's going to take a significant amount of time with social distancing for your staff to get up to their workspace. So finding a way to work with that, understanding that you're going to have to be a little bit more lenient with arrival time. Specific employee concerns, already been discussed here: medical, ADA, FMLA, HIPAA, and your state concerns. Leave. To the extent you are less than 500 employees, whether you are a governmental employer or not, you are bound by the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and your obligation to have a bank of 80 additional hours for people who are ill with COVID or who are quarantined with by medical recommendation, or who are caring for people who are sick or children who have no childcare because of COVID. Be aware of your high-risk employees, but at the same time, be aware that the ADA prohibits you from asking certain questions. And this brings me into one of my last points, which is one of Rod's points. There has never been a time where it's been more important to have a good, communicating, two-way relationship with your employees. We're great at, most of us are trial lawyers, we're good communicators. Communicating with our employees is as important as it is to convince a jury that you're right. So making sure that you are communicating with them eases their stress, lets them know they're being heard, gives them an avenue to be heard, and makes it less likely that they're going to bring claims in the future. So I just urge you to continue that process as you move forward, and make sure that your employment assistance programs, your mental health programs are widely accessible. So I told Jean and Rod I would stay and be happy to answer questions. If you want to ask me something, you've got my information here. Rod knows where to find me. I'm happy to take your calls anytime and answer any questions you might have.
Dana, thank you very much for that, and we really appreciate it. Dana is so efficient as a lawyer. She jumped in before I could give her my my intro, but she did it well herself. And so thank you very much for being here, and we really appreciate you giving us some time today and your perspective. I think it's really great and useful because a lot of us, including my office, we do have labor unions that we work with, and even if you don't, these are issues that you really try and think through and figure out. So it's really useful for us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I think Kim Worthy is probably not with us today. I believe that's right. If you are, Kim, shout out. But who is here is Kim brought along Matt Weezy. Did I get your name right, Matt? Perfect, excellent. Matt is from Marquette County, Michigan. He is the DA there. He's also an adjunct professor at Northern Michigan University. And Kim pulled Matt for us, so thanks to Kim for doing that, but also thanks to Matt for being willing to do this for us. Matt is one of those who managed to have a trial during a pandemic. And so, Matt, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you very much. I had a domestic violence trial on a habitual domestic violence felony offender who also committed great bodily harm. So we had two very serious felonies, and there was a habitual violent offender enhancement with this defendant, which meant he was looking at a 25-year minimum mandatory if convicted. And when the pandemic hit, his trial had already been adjourned one time due to another more serious case, an armed robbery that I tried. And so when it came up to jury trial date, the judge suggested that we consider a bench trial, and the defense was willing to waive jury, and I was hesitant to do that. The defense wanted to because under Michigan law, the 8 prior domestic violence convictions of this defendant were coming in as evidence. I had 18 witnesses lined up for that trial, including 8 prior victims of his domestic violence and an assortment of police officers who investigated those cases, because the other acts come in under Michigan law. And that created a lot of problems because if we waived jury, we were going to be working in a courtroom with 10 or less people and maintaining social distancing, and the judge wanted us to have as many witnesses testify remotely as possible. So after some consideration, I made a strategic decision to just admit his prior convictions of domestic violence through certified copies of that. The defense, I believe, was hoping that the judge would be a little less impacted by the history of the jury, maybe. And so I presented the case that way. The victim my victim, her legs were broken by this person after he threw her on the ground and stomped on her repeatedly and threatened to kill her. It was a delayed report case, so I had a domestic violence expert to testify to the domestic violence dynamics. And I also had to call the doctors that had treated her for her injuries to talk about the injuries and how they were inflicted. So everybody except for the defendant and the victim testified remotely. That included 2 doctors, a police officer, and a domestic violence expert. And the victim and the defendant were in the courtroom the whole time. I spent quite a bit of time with the victim talking about the trial in preparation, both for the first trial and this one. The case happened last June, and we had seen a lot of our people getting released on PR bonds because of the pandemic, including quite a few capital level offenses. And my fear was that if I didn't agree to waive jury, this person could be out on a personal recognizance bond. So after consulting with the victim quite extensively about that and just putting our faith in her testimony, because she was very strong in her testimony, we decided to go forward. She did an excellent job in the courtroom. She was able to identify the defendant, which is a concern, testifying remotely, of course. And the defendant also testified, which I don't think was a great strategic move on his part, but with the 8 prior convictions, it turned into quite a mess for him on cross-examination. The long and the short of it is that the judge did find him guilty of the more serious offense, which kicked in the 25-year mandatory minimum on the violent habitual offender, and the victim was greatly relieved about the case. I spent quite a bit of time on the phone with the victim, and then when the trial happened, we had her and her mother wait. Her mother acted as her support person. They waited in a remote room, and of course we had face masks and people We didn't have face masks in the courtroom because we were all more than 6 feet apart, but anytime we were in common spaces or moving through the courthouse. So it was a very interesting experience. We used Zoom, and Zoom was linked to our court recording system. Our IT guys were able to do that. And then because the defendant has a right to a public trial, they streamed the trial live on YouTube, which my colleagues around the state found out about it. So I had 82 armchair quarterbacks watching me and second guessing everything I did. But I just tried to put that out of my mind and tried the case like I would any other case.
We learn as we go, don't we, Matt?
Pardon?
That we learn as we go here on these.
Yeah, we definitely do. So it was a very interesting experience. It's the only trial that we had in Michigan under the pandemic. The Michigan Supreme Court suspended all jury trials until June 22nd. So it was either try a bench trial or possibly see this person get released on a personal recognizance bond, and I didn't want to see that happen. So it was interesting. Some of the technology was a little wonky, as you know, talking like this through the internet, but we were able to present the case. The doctors had their medical records in front of them, and we had their medical records in front of us, and I could reference page 2, paragraph 1, second sentence. So we didn't have much problems with that. And, it's not ideal, but, it worked. And we are now looking to do like they are in Portland to set up jury trials as best we can. And we have some jury trial projects that we're working on right now so that as we go forward, we can actually try cases to a jury, because this was a unique circumstance. I don't think a lot of times we're going to have a jury waiver by both sides.
Thank you so much for that, Matt. And just to kind of clarify, in your case, did your domestic violence victim survivor, did she testify in the courtroom or was she elsewhere?
Yep, she was live in the courtroom, and the only people in the courtroom were the judge, the defendant, the victim, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and court security staff, and the victim's mother as a support person. We felt that was probably best to have her in the courtroom for that reason.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matt. We really appreciate you coming in and telling us about your experience. And I know that I've got to kind of move us along here because it looks like we are, I'm getting us close to our time frames. I want to keep respecting everyone's time. But Sherry, you were on the line as well, and I wanted to see Wyrick, you're an assistant prosecutor from Wayne County, if there was anything else that you wanted to add.
Hi, I'm Sherry Wyrick. I'm an assistant prosecuting attorney at the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, and I work in the Special Prosecutions Division. So I handle non-fatal shootings in the city of Detroit. Honestly, I don't want to be repetitive, so I don't have a lot to add. I did a remote exam a few weeks ago, and the way we also used Zoom, and they also broadcast it over YouTube. So my victim actually testified. What we did is the victim went to the precinct and she testified remotely from the precinct. So the victim actually preferred to do it that way. She didn't actually, our courthouse is actually closed. So at this point, any testimony has to be taken remotely. And so she testified. She obviously had to, wear a mask. She went into the precinct and testified that way. And the defendant is actually also remote at the jail. So the jail actually zooms in to the courtroom. So the only person that's actually in the courtroom is the judge and the court reporter and the clerk.
Thank you, Sherry. Appreciate
you're welcome.
You with us. So for those of us who are, on the call, if you got a couple of great resources here to reach out to. I think one of the things that we've learned is to think about how victims can do identification when they are remote. Jerry sounds like she's someone you can call to give some input about that. And the use of Zoom or another device perhaps, or another service that may be deemed a little bit more secure. I don't know. It seems like Zoom is coming along though. And just some of the other issues about recording those kind of proceedings. And I know Matt talked about that, having a bunch of Monday morning quarterbacks on that happening in his case, but it is something to think about. So thank you both for doing that. I want to push us on now to kind of keep us on an agenda here, but I want to introduce Cyrus Vance. For everyone who doesn't know Cyrus, he is the Manhattan DA. He has been in that role since 2011. I think that's right. Did I get that right? 2010, one of those two. He's been around a while. So, and as you all know, Cyrus is someone that we all rely on pretty heavily for his expertise. He runs a really thorough and great office with a lot of resources for many of us to lean on. So Cyrus, you have the floor, and thank you so much for being here today. Cy, I think you are still muted.
All right, great. Thank you, Jean. And thank all my colleagues who are also presenting, and thank you all who are here as participants for taking time out on the Friday before Memorial Day to attend this conference. Our office is situated in New York City in Manhattan. We have about 550 to 600 lawyers and about 1,500 people all in, including lawyers and staff. So it's a very big office, and it's also an office that is in one of the media centers of the world. So in terms of external communications, and the degree to which external communications can affect internal attitudes and in the office of lawyers and employees during a crisis, it's a very active and sometimes intense media that we need to deal with. I'm not pretending to be an expert in communication. I think I suggested to Jean that someone ought to talk about communication, and then she said, okay, you talk about communication. So here I am, and here's what our experience was in Manhattan, and I'm sure it's similar to some of the comments that have been made previously. By early March of this year, our staff was aware of and coming to work with news of the coronavirus spreading in our country and becoming more dire. And as you all probably know, New York State has accounted for roughly 1/3 of the fatalities in the United States from COVID-19 to date. So we knew that our city and the density of our city and the transportation subways in our city was going to make New York vulnerable. The first confirmed case of coronavirus in our state came in on March 1, and by March 9, there were 16 confirmed cases in New York City. And so the direction that this disease was taking was of growing concern to us. Really coincidentally, at that time, we met with representatives of the State University of New York in Albany to talk with us about how to prepare for an emergency in our office. We've always had, obviously, the need to have emergency plans, but this happened to coincide really not by design, but by accident with the introduction of COVID-19. And Sudi gave us, as on the screen, some basic emergency preparedness goals that ended up informing what we then did to communicate about the coronavirus in the weeks and month that followed. And what they felt an office should do is in front of you, and a lot of it is logical. But when an emergency strikes, the management needs to lead, and leading means to speak, and speaking means to identify what you need to talk about, which at the time of great upset and an emergency are what are our core values, what drives our assistants and employees to do the work that they do. Who are those in the community that are stakeholders in public safety and a fair justice system in Manhattan and in the country beyond. Situational parameters, constraints, these are all fairly straightforward. And secondly, in communicating through a crisis, to identify some issues that you needed to communicate about, which is to communicate effectively to the public and internally about how we're going to continue to fulfill our public safety and our public fairness missions as prosecutors, even during the time of crisis. Obviously, we need to focus on workplace safety, the resilience of our office to respond to crises and bounce back, and to sustainability of our efforts during the duration of something that we could not predict, and that in this case has gone on for a long time. And to build general and specific preparedness and communicate that to the office as we go forward. And following that, I'm quite sure we didn't do what SUNY Albany told us to do perfectly, but we tried to adapt their recommendations in the plans around communication that we then executed. So next slide, please. So here, focusing on the emergency preparedness and what we needed to do in terms of communication. As an office, we needed to stay close to our core values, but needed to identify them so we could rely upon understanding them in this crisis. Maintaining public safety, ensuring justice, we'll talk about that briefly, but there's obviously a great upset in the country, in many cities and elsewhere, about the reality of individuals being incarcerated during the coronavirus outbreak. And in congregate settings that are often difficult to have social spacing and difficult in some instances to prevent the disease from spreading. So we had ensuring justice. We spoke for our victims, for the police officers who put their lives on the line every day they go out there and try to preserve and keep the streets safe, as well as those folks, the defendants, for whom we are also responsible for to a certain degree. Our staff holders, stakeholders, who matters to us and who do we need to be communicating with during this time period, and make sure that we are touching them. My executive staff, our executive staff, they are the team leaders for the office, and I need to be communicating with them, and we need to be on the same page about what our core values are, what our problems are, and how we're going to address them throughout the office. HR, we have a wonderful HR department, and HR, but the employees are concerned about lots of stuff, such as I read in the paper that the city is going to cut back because of the budget crisis on. There are going to be layoffs in public service jobs, and HR, human resources, is going to get besieged and has been with questions about, does this mean furlough? Issues about insurance, a whole host of issues that flow through the HR department, and they needed to know what our plans were, and we needed to know what our responsibilities were and what the ground facts were presenting in the city at that time. And to the leadership, obviously, of the units that the divisions of our big and robust office, our trial division, which has the bulk of our assistants, investigations division, and our appeals division. And we have a very sophisticated communications office with about 15 or 20 people who work in it, because we have a huge and robust number of requests for communication and information come to us. Rod talked about this: clear, frequent communication with all staff on a daily basis. And there are constraints, obviously, about things that we can talk about, which include medical constraints like HIPAA, personnel issues that sometimes overlap with HIPAA, such as, does a person who is a staff member who may be subject to the coronavirus or may fear they have it, what is told about that, to whom about that individual, or what requirements need to be met. Family members of the lawyers and professional staff who work there, and we are constrained by the city, state, and court directives. The governor decides when the court system is going to open in our state, not the chief judge. He's guided by the chief judge, but it's really the governor's decision, and we have to respond to that. So next slide, please. So meeting those emergency preparation things that I identified, how do we fulfill our mission, and how do we set the staff to know that how we're going to do it? Teleworking. Everyone has some experience with teleworking that we didn't predict we were going to have, but our office within 2 weeks was essentially 98% virtual. And if an office as big as ours, 1,500 people, that was really a feat by our IT professionals. We have a very robust IT department, and thank God for that. But they enabled us to direct to the assistants and the staff, here's the work that we want you to continue to do to respond to the court functions that we need to fill, arraignments, writing up cases, now preliminary hearings. We need to be able to do that. We need to tell them and teach them the tools to enable them to do it. Obviously, the staff needs to know that they matter, and this is obviously a huge concern. We have a number of communications that go out, and we can talk about those in the staff. But right now, preparedness was, how are we going to do our job? How are we going to attend the concerns of the office? And how do we communicate the office about what the return to world work is going to look like? And in our case, in New York, we may not have grand jurors or juries for 3 to 6 months because of the social distancing challenges of being in an urban environment. You can't just drive up to my office building and get a parking space and go into work. When you go to work, if you go to work as a lawyer, there needs to be someone in the staff in there to clean, make sure the spaces are clean afterwards. So it's complex. It was hard to get us out. It's going to be even harder for us to get back into the building. And long term, the uncertainty of what happens if COVID-19 comes back after we hope it lulls, and to be able to understand that and be able to communicate to the employees about what that's going to look like if it happens. Next slide, please. So communication, we have a fantastic administrative assistant, DA Bonnie Sard, who communicates every day with office-wide emails, providing essential medical, informational, sometimes humorous and supportive statements to the entire staff every day at the end of every day. And this becomes something that I think all employees look forward to, because every day they're getting a piece of information that's relevant to their situation right now, which is not just their situation, it affects their family, it affects their livelihood, it affects their medical health. I do a weekly update to the entire office on Friday afternoons, and I just sent mine in at the beginning of this conference, and made sure I could get that out to the employees, because I got a lot of folks who are editing it saying it's not quite right, so they want to make sure that I get it right. One of the most important things that we focused on is what we call our DANI, District Attorney of New York County Net. It's our internal communication network. And Bonnie Sard uses that internal communication network to pull in for the office, a huge number of resources they wouldn't necessarily know how to go to or get them in one place. The CDC, the World Health Organization, orders coming out from the governor, what the rules coming out from the city. So any employee in our office really can get very up-to-date new reports and information internally on our district attorney's internal communication. Like many of the DAs here, I have met with probably almost every assistant in the office of 600 lawyers at this time by Zoom, and communicated with them directly, mostly to tell them what's going on, but to answer questions. And in those calls, I've been really instructed to what matters to them very much is, how am I going to get to work? Do I have to take the subway? What happens if my family, if my mother, if I'm living with someone who has preconditioning conditions, like not in school? What am I going to do? Back to school order isn't lifted by the fall. So there are lots of questions that come in these meetings with all the assistants in the office. Some of the comments are critical, like, I don't think that you communicated with us, Mr. Vance, well enough about the governor's order. And those are all, those are criticisms that I don't take personally. I take them as an opportunity to learn something from what the office is experiencing. And we all can imagine how tough it is for particularly the young men and women who work in these offices. They want information, and many of the recent graduates from college and law school sort of expect a degree of communication that I would not have expected when I was an assistant DA back in the 1980s. They want more information. They think they should have more information. And by the way, most of the time they're right. And so you need to listen to them. Weekly check-ins with my executive staff. Sometimes those meetings, they're scheduled for an hour and a half. They usually go on for up to 2 hours. This week, for example, and last week, we just had a crush of violent crime in New York. Our crime numbers went down in April. Our arrests went down for street arrests, but something is going on that no one can quite put their finger on. But there's a lot of serious violent crime that we're dealing with, and from a communications perspective, from a support of the assistants who are handling these cases, from guiding me about what's going on, these weekly Zoom calls with the executive staff are very interesting. And I like to, and I think like most of you, I like to see their faces. I mean, it's nice to see each other after we've been gone for almost 2 months. So those weekly check-ins and communicating inside the office are important. Next slide. And I think I'm almost done, Gene. There's external communication that obviously we all, as DAs, as executives of the office, we respond to a ton of media inquiries, even in this time. We aren't having trials. We're not having trials, so the reporters are not as interested in preliminary hearings that they have to attend virtually as they would by just going to court. But still, there's a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we need to deal with. Rikers Island and who should be in Rikers Island at this time. We've spent, there have been an enormous amount of legal proceedings challenging the rules in Rikers Island and the bail conditions. And the media is actively following that and writing about that, and we need to be able to communicate effectively about that. I decided that I was going to do a census of every person in Rikers Island that we had who was a Manhattan defendant, and it was over 2,000 at the beginning of a coronavirus period. It's now down about 41%. But I saw, as I assume many of us did, that this was going to be one of the big challenges for prosecutors that we were going to face, which is not change bail rules, but whether as a matter of discretion, we were going to change the way during a time period of crisis, apply discretionary standards for release pretrial that would be different than those that we applied before. And I communicated to that first and foremost to my staff about why I was doing what I was doing for the office. And many of my staff members are career prosecutors, and they were sort of at first alarmed, and some were upset that I would be changing sort of the ground rules and having non-statutory factors be considered in terms of discretionary release. And I heard that, and I talked to them about it. But I absolutely think that reducing our Rikers population in the case of Manhattan by 41%, in the case of the city of New York, our population of Rikers Island is now at its lowest point since 1946. Now, that doesn't mean that coronavirus that no one is going to get sick in jail and no one's going to die in jail. But what it did do was motivate. I needed to communicate to the staff the direction that we were going to take and the reasons we were going to take it. And I think that has served our office well from a number of perspectives, including just being able to say to anyone who asks, this is why we believe this person should still be in jail under these circumstances. And we've had like this event, virtual summit events with prosecutors around the country and with interest groups talking about externally what we're doing and why, and learning from others what they're doing and why. And it's events like this that I and I think and other assistant DAs and DAs who attend and listen learn a hell of a lot. And I always go back home saying, this is what Gene is doing in KC. So let's take a look at that. And I appreciate all that my colleagues are doing in their offices around the country. I think I'm wrapping up here. And do I have another slide? Oh yes, Gene, you'll appreciate this. A great person from Missouri once said a very simple thing, which is, you know, the head of every organization is where the buck stops. And I have on my desk a whatever you want to call that thing, which that sign on the desk that the buck stops here. And I think for those of us who are elected DAs or whatever, you know, in whatever organization you work, ultimately you're responsible and accountable. Even if you're not responsible for initial decision, you are accountable for the communication or lack of communication in your office. And as Rod said, and as others have said, this is something that in this time period where people are afraid, they are scared and they're concerned about their future. They're concerned about their security coming back to work. They need to be given information because with knowledge, there is less fear. And knowledge, we are making better decisions and the institution is able to move forward and through crises like this in a more connected and healthy way. So thanks, Gene.
Thank you, Sign. I appreciate President Truman. That was a nice one. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move us along, and that leads us to Spencer Merriweather. Spencer is maybe newer to us as a DA, the leader of his organization in Mecklenburg County, Charlotte, that's in the Charlotte area of North Carolina. But he is also not new to the job. He has been in that job since 2017, but he has worked as a DA in that office for many years. So thank you for your previous service, Spencer. Thank you for your service today, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Gene. I appreciate being here. And let me start by picking up where Cy left off and just saying that this whole notion of the buck stopping with the leader of the office is weighty. And I can tell you after only about 30 months in office, there wasn't a section in my manual about a pandemic. So I think we're all having to learn on the fly. And it goes without saying that I'm in awe of the kind of command that the previous panelists have demonstrated over their offices and dealing with this crisis. And I am trying to learn as I go along, just as all of us are. It's important, or at least I've learned just in the last few weeks, that it's important to realize that we can do our best, but none of this occurs in a vacuum. The role of the prosecutor, even in a courthouse, it doesn't occur in a vacuum. In many ways, it's about the relationships that we're able to build with the people in and around our offices. It has helped me to remember as we go into this next stage of reopening, and I'll be again talking about reopening committees, to think about what it was that fueled us during the shutdown of operations. And what fueled us at that time was this sense of imminence, this sense of we know that everything has to shut down within a matter of days, or at least our operations have to significantly contract within a number of days. There was nothing particularly nuanced about the fact that it had to contract. We just knew that things had to happen. We also knew that our ultimate goal was a singular one, that all of the things that we think about and potentially disagree with our other stakeholders in the court system, everyone was singularly thoughtful about public health. And we still are. But through that shutdown, we all had that one singular overarching common goal. That's the next slide. With that common goal, you got collaboration, you got partnership, you've got common ground. Essentially, you've got the Hilltop ad from the Coke ad. You basically have this harmony throughout your courthouse. And in many ways, no one can imagine the fact that within just a matter of hours, you've got your judges and your defense bar and your prosecutor, and you've got activists all thinking about common solutions to how we actually achieve public health within a criminal justice system. And we did it. The next stage, however, is a little bit more complicated. And we can go to the next slide. In reopening, everyone starts to think about their competing priorities again. Everyone starts to think about limited resources because reopening is nuanced. It is about not only everyone trying to get back to their ordinary position in an ordinary circumstance, but also doing it with limited circumstances. In my courthouse, I know that instead of having 8 courtrooms at my disposal, now maybe I've got 2. And instead of having a full 8 hours of a judge's attention, I might only have 2. And so what does that mean in the way that I interact with other stakeholders in a court system? These reopening committees are actually a nice window into that discussion, and it is not easy. In many ways, the type of disagreements that you have in an ordinary basis can be heightened because we're having these discussions now in the midst of crisis. We're having them in the midst of when tensions are high. No one has ever seen anything like this before, and the goals aren't unitary. As a matter of fact, they're competing. So that's something to be thoughtful about as we go into how you build relationships with all of these stakeholders. Go to the next slide. The adversaries that you usually have are not necessarily going to be the ones that you have through this period. The truth is that while you might go toe-to-toe with your defense bar and toe-to-toe with your public defender in court, interestingly enough, you have everything in common with the public defender and the defense bar at this time because you are the ones who are prioritizing the handling of your cases. You know that amid a public health crisis like this one, that you don't want to create a second public health crisis by completely abandoning your attention to criminal justice issues. And so your chief, your public defender, and your defense bar can actually serve as your best ally throughout this process, particularly when you are thinking about the reopening committees within your court system. Next slide. The usual people who are the neutral parties, now they've got to balance the interest of their criminal justice system against others in your court system, and that gets complicated. And we'll start with judges. Judges first. Our interactions with judges usually are within the confines of a court system or thinking through an administrative court plan for your jurisdiction. And now you are beginning to see how judges have to balance not only the interest of the criminal justice system, but also the civil bar. You're beginning to think about clerks, court clerks, and the fact that now you are probably in a reopening committee going to learn a lot more about the labor limitations of your clerk of court, because if your clerk of court is office is anything like mine, you're going to have a high number of particularly high risk people in that office, which may mean that at least in this day and time, that the hours that they can provide within your court system is limited. That again puts a strain on the resources that you've got in your court system. You may be thinking about your defense bar and their private defense bar. And it may be that while they have an interest in making sure that there are a lot of resources dedicated to the criminal justice system, it's for different reasons. We have in North Carolina actually had a huge push from our private defense bar in some of our rural counties to try to get jury trials started last month, which may seem crazy to a lot of people. And we found out that one of the reasons why that folks wanted to get back into court, quite frankly, was because of the lack of financial resources for their offices. It was either that or laying off their staff. That certainly wouldn't be in line with the interest that you have as a minister of justice. And so you've got those things that you're sort of contending with. Your civil bar, while all of the deadlines for divorces and for evictions and everything else has sort of been put to the side for a number of weeks, when your chief justice or whoever it is who decides to make the order to reopen court, that person is all those deadlines are going to hit at one time. And that civil bar is waiting, and they are also going to be depending on all of those resources at one time. And that's going to mean that they're going to ask that some of operation of criminal justice proceedings actually take a back seat. So this is a very difficult time where we are not operating in a vacuum. It's not just about our issues, but again, all of our issues are being balanced against a whole lot of other things that on a daily basis, we don't think about as prosecutors. However, I'll go to the next slide. Your interests are unique because when people think of the legal system, when people think of what happens at a courthouse, it's actually your interest and your issues are the ones that people think about. People think that they don't want someone who to break into their home. They don't want harm done to their person. They don't want things to happen to their children. And if those things actually do happen, they want to make sure that someone is actually held accountable for them. They want to make sure that there is some place of recourse for protecting their lives and their family and their property. And those things are, quite frankly, newsworthy. Those are the things that capture the attention of an entire community. And that is something that, as leaders within a criminal justice system within our various jurisdictions, we have to make sure that we remind the people who are serving with us on these reopening committees that our issues are important. It may be that it just is sheer numbers that your cases only represent, quite frankly, a small fraction of what happens in the courthouse. But you can never lose sight of the fact or let anyone else lose sight of the fact that it's a very critical portion of what goes on in the courthouse, critical to what goes on in your community, and critical to the public health of your community. Next slide. It's not all gloom and doom because there is a way out of or a way forward as we think about how we can manage these relationships. And the most important thing that I can say from the experience that I've had over the course of the last few weeks is that it's really important that everyone is getting the same information. And I'll give an example of this in just a second. It's also more important than ever, and I think we've seen that demonstrated in some of the discussion already today, that we draw in different partners from your city and county and state government. And as Joff said earlier, it's important that you build a connection with that health director. As Sai was speaking about the types of information that he has been sure to provide to his staff, the health director's information for me locally has been wonderful for me to impart to my staff. It has shaped most of the policies, both in my office as well as in the courthouse. And that means that I've got to make sure I'm on the phone with that health director, that health director is also letting us know what is possible for our courthouse, what is possible for our court proceedings. I'll again give you an example in just a second about how that was done in my jurisdiction. It's important that when you are examining how you might move forward as a criminal justice system, that you are examining everything through a COVID lens. For me, this meant taking a tour of our courthouse with our chief district court judge and our senior resident superior court judge, as well as our public defender, as well as other representatives from our court system, and seeing exactly what 6-foot distancing looks like in a courthouse. Go to the next slide. And particularly looking at how a courtroom could function in a pandemic. I'll start with the photo we've got in the upper left-hand corner, and that's just the jury box itself. And I think all of us have some familiarity with walking into the well of a courtroom and distancing yourself from the seats in a jury panel, and seeing sort of what it looks like from the jury perspective, and then seeing what it looks like from the perspective of an advocate. Well, now imagine yourself in the midst of social distancing, and what do you see? Well, for us, our reopening committee saw that we had a need for not only dividers in between each and every chair, but also a sneeze guard between the back row and the front row. And the more that we talked about the possibility of this temporary structures we could erect to get through this, we felt a lot more positive about our prognosis for actually having jury trials in the near future. We thought about what it means to gather 70 potential panelists in a room, and how we would go about doing that, how large of a room we would need to carry on jury selection. What happens when we actually end up with those jurors in a jury box? How is it that they're able to hear evidence, to make sure that whatever petitions we put in between those chairs are transparent ones, so they still will have the opportunity to see and clearly hear evidence. With the photo on the bottom right hand of the slide, you'll see that we had to give some thought about the interaction between counsel and the defendant. And we also decided that it was a good idea to erect a barrier there as well, because there needed to be also a 6 foot distance there as well. And we figured out that we were able to do that. And so at that point, we realized that, we think that we have the blueprint for how we can carry on these court proceedings, within a matter of weeks. And then we thought about the fact that we actually had to have our jurors deliberate, which usually means going into a tight room and having everyone sort of sit around and be able to talk closely with one another, exchange ideas, ask each other questions, and have sort of free reign of a room as they enter into these conversations. And that's when a lot of our plans, quite frankly, began to fall apart. We knew that in a couple of our deliberation rooms, we would be able to build bank teller sort of dividers between folks as they were able to deliberate. But we also realized that in most of our deliberation rooms, quite frankly, the dimensions were too tight and it wasn't possible. That our deliberation rooms were the one rooms in our courthouse that actually had no recording ability within that particular courtroom, in order to protect the sanctity of jury deliberations. And so we were limited in what sort of places we were able to, create or have a substitute deliberation room. So these are all things that reopening committees are extremely important, because you come to this with your perspective. You come to this with the perspective that you have when you walk out of the front door of your office building. But as you interact with others and you think about the perspectives that they have, it can't help but impact how you all move forward as a justice system, how you operate within a justice system, how your proceedings actually operate. So in closing, I'll just say this. This is again, so much harder than what happened the first couple of weeks. The first couple of weeks were extremely hard for all of our offices. But it's nothing compared to this very nuanced, very layered, very complex process of reopening. And I think that, you just have to remember that it's all about the relationships that you're able to establish and the perspective that you're able to make sure that you're taking in from all of your other parties in your court system.
Well, Spencer, thank you for kind of taking us home. And Jean, thank you for moderating the webinar this afternoon. In addition, all of the members of our board and the other both prosecutors as well as experts really took us home for sharing the efforts and how do we ensure the safety of our employees in our community. For the audience, thank you for hanging with us. We did go over time, and we apologize on behalf of APA for that, but there's so much information and it's so fluid. We felt that it was important to continue to get the information out there, and please look to us, both what documents are all of your offices generating, and at the same time, we will continue to share with others. As we said at the beginning, please watch for next month. We will, in June, have another webinar. We'll be trying to cover probably the next step or the next phase. But continue to do good things for your communities. If you have additional questions coming out of this webinar, please email us at webinars@apainc.org. Thank you for attending, and enjoy your holiday weekend.